Hi, welcome back to Manohar Academy. In the previous lesson, we have already discussed about constructors in some detail. But in that class, I mentioned that there are few more concepts we have to cover. So we are going to look at them in this particular lesson. But before doing that, let's see what we already learned on constructors. So constructors are very similar to methods, but at the same time, they are very different. They have a different purpose. And constructor name is always same as the class name. So if the class name is myDate, the constructor name is also myDate. And we know that constructor cannot return anything, so constructor doesn't have any return type. If there is no user defined constructor, and only in that particular case, the compiler will provide us a default constructor. But if there are any user defined constructors, one or more, then the compiler doesn't do anything. It doesn't provide you default constructor. When we say default constructor, we mean the constructor with no input arguments and which does nothing. Okay, also we know that constructor has to be always invoked using the new keyword in order to create a new object. Okay, I want to highlight few points here, but I want to show you in a different slide using different pictures. Okay, so here we have a class called myDate. It has 3 fields and we did not define any constructor. So when the compiler tries to compile this program, it sees that there is no constructor in this class. So compiler thinks, okay, this class is very poor and no one will be able to create any objects of this particular class unless there is a constructor. So because it is very poor and it doesn't have any constructor, the compiler will provide us a default constructor. So in this case, myDate, the default constructor, is going to be included by the compiler. We did not code it, but the compiler included it. Because the compiler included that particular constructor, we can call that constructor to create a new object. Okay, this is the case where compiler is providing us the default constructor. And let's move on. Here I have defined a class myDate. It has the same fields, but in this case, I created a constructor myself. So we have a user defined constructor. And this constructor is taking 3 input arguments. Okay, when the compiler is trying to compile this program, not this program, this particular class, the compiler sees the constructor, and in this case it does not provide the default constructor because there is already one constructor. So the compiler thinks, okay, the user or the developer has already taken care of the construction part, so I should not include any default constructor. The developer doesn't want it, so I should not provide it. So in this case, if you try to call the default constructor, it is going to be a compilation error. You can't call it because it's not there. You did not create, and also the compiler won't provide this in this particular case, so you can't call it. But you can very well call the constructor that you have defined, that is the constructor which takes 3 arguments. Okay, this is the third case where I have defined a class, but in this particular case I provided the default constructor myself. So in this case also the compiler is not going to do anything. Whatever constructors we have defined, they are going to be there, but in this particular case we can call the default constructor. We can also call the other constructor that is taking 3 arguments. Okay, that is all about these slides. Let's learn the new concepts. Okay, this is our previous class, but I removed all the getters and setters so you don't see them. So we have the class. Also let me remove these fields so we can keep it simple. So we have a default constructor. We have a constructor with 3 arguments. So also in the previous lessons, we created a object by invoking the constructor with 3 arguments. Also we created a object by invoking the constructor with no arguments, that is the default constructor. Let's run this program. Okay. Okay. So this is there in the toString method. I removed those, but they are still here. So here we can see that the myDate object is printed as per the constructor calls. So in one case we provided all the values, so it is 2012 January 1st. In other case we did not provide any values, so all the values are defaults. I want to demonstrate things. So let me include some lines in between. Okay, here you can see what happens when we do the first thing, when we call the second one. Okay, here it is good. Here also let me print some messages. Okay, here we can see that in the first case we called the constructor with 3 arguments, and in the second case we call the default constructor. Okay, so far so good. Now I am going to create one more constructor, but this time it is going to take year, only year. So I am going to assign that year to our field. Then for month and day I am going to provide January 1st. Okay, let me also do let me provide some default values here as well. I am going to set the default values as 1900 January 1st. Okay, let me print it again. Okay, when we called constructor with 3 arguments there is no change, but when we call the default constructor, this time it is having the default date, that is 1900 January 1st. Okay, so let me create one more object. But in this case let me call the other constructor I am only providing year 2017 and also I am going to print that object. Okay, now we have 3 constructors, and first time we called the default constructor, so far so good. Also we know about in first case we called the constructor with 3 arguments, in the second case we called the default constructor, in the third case we provided only year, but we have assigned default values for month and day. Okay, now if we see here, the same code is repeated 3 times. So we are going to see the same problems that we have seen when we were discussing the dry principle. Here if I start creating new fields, I need to assign values in all of them, and I may make mistakes. Also, the code duplication is something we want to avoid, right? So here, if I can call this particular constructor from here, that would be great. So let me pass whatever value I have received, and let me pass some default values for month and day. Okay, but it is giving the compilation error. So it says I can't call the other constructor. That is because to call the other constructor you can't use the constructor name, you have to use this keyword. Okay, now you may be thinking, previously we are already using this keyword to access the fields, but this time we are using this keyword as a method name, something like a method name, right? That is absolutely true. You can use this keyword for 2 purposes. One is to access the member fields in the class, and to call the other constructor. So let's do the same thing here also. This, and in this case we want to pass what is the year, 1900 January 1st. Okay, I am waiting for a compilation error. Okay, we got the compilation error. Wow. In this particular case, in line 30, 31, 32, 33, I am able to call the other constructor and I am able to pass the values. Why am I not able to pass the values in this particular case? What is the difference between the highlighted code and this one? So what is the difference between these 2 constructors? Okay, so we can see that in one case the other constructor is called in the first line, in other case the other constructor is called in the second line. We can't do that. We have to always call the other constructor in the first line. That is a limitation, and that is very much required, because after assigning some values we don't want to call the other constructor. We want to call the other constructor first. After that, here you can do anything, like here you can again give some values for day, so that is okay, but that is not the purpose of this one. Actually we are calling the other constructor so that the assignment will happen at one place. Okay, other way of saying is it is a specialized constructor. It is going to set the values for all the fields. It is a very specialized constructor. We can call this specialized constructor from the general constructor. So here I don't have any input values, but I can call this specialized constructor to set all the values. In this case also I have only one value, but I can call the specialized constructors to set the other values. In one constructor we are setting all the values, but in other constructors we are calling that particular constructor. So this is how we call the other constructor. So now now the most important part. Let me run this method, run this program. So in this first case we directly called the constructor with 3 arguments and we are good. We got one message saying constructor with 3 arguments is called, then we printed it. But in the second one we can clearly see that we called the default constructor, but because default constructor is in turn is calling the other constructor, as a first line we are going to see constructor with 3 arguments is called, because that is what is called on the first line. So after that is executed, we have the code in the default constructor executed. After that we just printed. So in the third case we call the constructor with 1 argument. Here you can see that we passed 2017, but from that constructor we are calling the other constructor. So that constructor completes. After that, whatever constructor we called, it is going to be completed. So here you can see all those things, how the constructor calls happens. For example, here instead of calling this specialized constructor, I can call this constructor as well. So in that case I just need to pass whatever year I have received. So that year comes here. After that there will be some default values that goes here. So in this case I even reduce the code, right? Whatever. So let me this case I am not calling the most specialized one, but whatever year I have, I am passing to the constructor that takes only year. We get the same output, but in this case, so if you see here, we call default constructor, that in turn called constructor with 1 argument, that in turn called constructor with 3 arguments. So this is how it happens. Even though we call default constructor, on the first line it called constructor with 1 argument, and inside constructor with 1 argument we call the constructor with 3 arguments on the first line. So this is how we get the output. Okay, now I explained this concept. I want you to practice this one. So write a program, create these 3 constructors and call other constructors, and make sure you are calling the other constructor from the first line, not on the second line. If you try to move this one to the second line, we are going to get a compilation error. Also I want to mention one more thing, like here we can never return any value, because here the constructor is going to return as a reference type and you can never create a reference type. So this is going to give compilation error. You can't return anything. But you can have a statement, simple statement which says return. So return means, okay, from this point return back from this constructor. So if you return from here, we are getting a compilation error, but that is for a different reason. That is because this statement will never be executed. But having this kind of return may or may not be useful, but understand, once return executed, whatever is there after that line won't get executed. You can't return anything, but you can have a return statement here. That is fine. So now one more thing. Here let me create one more reference variable, myDate4. Instead of calling constructor and assigning that object to this particular reference variable, the only thing that we can assign is null. So either we assign an object, in turn we are assigning a reference, either we do that or we can assign only null. As long as this particular reference is pointing to null, you can't call any methods. So here, okay, I don't have isLeap here. Okay, let me call toString. Okay, so I can't call this method because inside toString you can see that it is trying to access three fields called year, month and day, and these fields are present inside that object. But here there is no object, you have null, so that null object or null reference is not going to have those fields. So whenever you do something like this, you are going to get an exception. This is a runtime exception. So here you can clearly see null pointer exception. So what is happening is you are calling a method on a reference variable, but this reference variable is not pointing to any object. So if there is no object, there are no fields. So without those fields, you can't print those fields. So in this case, you get a null pointer exception. So the takeaway from this particular second part of the lesson is, for a reference type myDate, either you can assign an object that in turn assigns the reference to that particular object, or you can assign null. Once you assign null, you can't call any methods on that particular variable. So also one more thing, here let's say we created object, we assigned the object to that one, we are done with using that object. So let me say we print that object, then I can assign this null to this particular variable. Okay, so when this particular statement is executing, the reference variable or this myDate4 is pointing to a object. So this is valid. You don't get any exception on that one. Also by assigning null, you don't get any exception. If I run it now, it goes just fine. You don't get any exceptions. Once you assign null, after that you can't call any methods on that particular reference variable because that reference variable is not pointing to object. This time we get a compilation error. Not compilation error, sorry, runtime error called null pointer exception. Okay, that is all about this class. What did we learn in this class? We learned that we can have as many constructors as we need, but they should have different signature. So for example, here default constructor doesn't take any arguments. This one takes only one argument. This takes 3 arguments. So we can have many constructors. So it is also called constructor overloading. Why do we call it constructor overloading? Because all the constructors have the same name. So we overloaded these constructors by creating 3 different constructors. Okay, we've overloaded basically because they're all sharing the same name. We call them as overloaded constructors. They all have different signatures. We are going to talk about method signatures in the next class or maybe next to next class. And if we want to call the other constructor, we have to call it on the first line, and also we have to use the keyword this instead of the constructor name. It has to be always on the first line and we have to use that keyword. Okay, that is about constructors. And also we have seen that for a reference variable, either we assign the object reference or we assign the null. The moment we assign the null, we can't call any methods on that particular reference because it's not pointing to an object. It has a null reference. It is not pointing to an object. So if it is not pointing to object, it doesn't have those fields. If we are trying to print those fields or if we are trying to access any of them, it is going to be an error. The error will occur at the runtime and it is going to be null pointer exception. Okay, that is all about this lesson. Thank you for listening. If you did not subscribe already, please go ahead and subscribe. If you are benefited from this video, if you like this video, please like it, share it with your friends so that they can also watch, they can also learn. That is all from my side. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.